Here is the assumption you bring into this episode, that giving humanity forbidden knowledge is a transgression. In the Book of Enoch, the Watchers are condemned for crossing a boundary. Descending from the heavenly realm, taking human wives, producing monstrous offspring, and transferring knowledge humanity was never meant to hold. Weapons, sorcery, astronomy, the arts of personal adornment. The sentence is darkness, burial beneath the earth, and fire reserved for a judgment still to come. The crossing, and what crosses with it, becomes the crime. A civilization whose traditions reach more than 1,000 years before. The Book of Enoch had beings who occupied a strikingly similar role. Descended from the divine realm, lived among human beings, and handed over the foundational knowledge of civilization itself: writing, law, architecture, agriculture, mathematics. That civilization did not bind them, it built monuments to them. Their name was the Apkallu. The same pattern, the opposite verdict. This video answers why. By the end of this video, you will know exactly who the Apkallu were, what they looked like, what specifically they gave humanity, and how their story connects to the flood. You will hold the precise structural parallel between the Apkallu and the Watchers. The same descent, the same transfer, the same flood, the same diminishment afterward. And you will understand why one tradition calls this a gift, and the other calls it a crime. This is not an abstract dispute. It is a question about what you are. Elevated by the knowledge that built your civilization, or corrupted by it. Two ancient traditions answer differently, and the tradition most of the Western world inherited made its choice before it had the comparison available to make it honestly. After the flood, Mesopotamian tradition records that these beings kept appearing, but changed. One of them, a sage named Lu-Nanna, is described in the record as only 2/3 Apkallu. Hold that. The Apkallu are 7 divine sages, whom Mesopotamian tradition credits with making humanity civilized. By the end of this chapter, you will know exactly who they were, how they appeared, what specifically they taught, and why a tradition that built monuments to them is describing the same act the Book of Enoch calls the origin of sin. In Sumerian, they were called Abgal. In Akkadian, Apkallu. A word that functions as both singular and plural. So a single Apkallu and 7 Apkallu take the same form. The tradition is precise about what they were. Not gods, but sages sent by a god. The god in question was Enki, Lord of Wisdom, and of the freshwater deep Mesopotamians believed flowed beneath the earth, the Abzu. Enki did not build civilization directly. He sent 7 beings to bring it. What the Apkallu carried was not simply information. Mesopotamian theology has a specific term for what they transmitted: the me. Divine decrees, the ordinances that make organized life possible. Kingship is a me. Priesthood is a me. Writing, law, temple building, music, the rites of mourning and the rites of love. Each one a me. Each one a piece of cosmic order made available to a species that had not previously held it. The descent of the me from the dwelling place of the gods to the cities of human beings is, in this tradition, the founding act of civilization. The Apkallu are simply the agents through which that founding act occurred. Before going further, a distinction the tradition itself insists on, and one this channel will maintain without exception. The Apkallu are not the Anunnaki, the great gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon, and they are not the Igigi, the lesser gods condemned to labor before humanity was created to relieve them of it. The Anunnaki rule, the Igigi labor and rebel. The Apkallu teach 3 categories, 3 functions, and a great deal of confusion in popular treatments that collapses them into one. The tradition kept them separate for a reason. Wisdom, in Mesopotamian theology, is not the same office as sovereignty, and a sage is not a king. The most fully described of the 7 is a figure named Oannes, preserved for the Greek-speaking world by the Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in the 3rd century BC. Berossus describes a being who emerged from the sea each day, instructed humanity in writing, mathematics, agriculture, law, and the founding of cities, and at night returned to the water. He ate no human food. He was, in Berossus's account, a creature bridging the boundary between the ordered world beneath the sea and the unordered world of early human life, present only long enough to close the gap between them. A second named figure carries even more theological weight. Adapa, remembered in Akkadian tradition as the first of the Apkallu and the priest-sage of the city of Eridu. The Adapa myth recounts an episode in which Adapa, in a fit of temper, breaks the wing of the south wind and is summoned before the sky god Anu to answer for it. Ea, the same god elsewhere called Enki, warns Adapa in advance. When Anu offers him the bread and water of immortality, he must refuse it. Adapa obeys, and in doing so loses, on behalf of all humanity, the chance at the kind of permanence the gods possess, while keeping and passing on the wisdom that made him useful to them in the first place. The myth functions as an origin story for the human condition itself, civilized, wise, capable of audience with the gods, and mortal, all 3 at once. And all 3 because a sage acting under divine instruction made a specific choice on humanity's behalf. The iconographic record beyond Oannes shows the Apkallu in 2 principal forms: winged human figures and figures cloaked in the body of a fish. The Umanu, master craftsmen, wise men who appear to be stepping out of an animal skin rather than wearing a costume. Both forms communicate the same idea visually: a being not fully of the world it has entered, a creature whose appearance announces its origin even as its function is to make that origin disappear into ordinary human life. The tradition does not record 7 generic sages assigned to no particular moment. Each of the 7 pre-flood Apkallu is tied to a specific antediluvian king and a specific reign. The list opens with a sage attending Alulim, the first king of Eridu in the tradition's own reckoning, and continues forward, sage by sage, king by king, until the flood, transmitting a specific portion of the me appropriate to that period of human development. This is not loose mythological color. It is a structured genealogy of cultural transmission, a record that claims to know, in order, which divine teacher gave humanity, which piece of civilization, and under which king it happened. A tradition this precise about lineage is making a serious historical claim about itself, not merely telling a story. The Assyriologist Wilfrid Lambert was among the first to establish, from the cuneiform evidence itself, that this lineage was treated within Mesopotamian scribal culture as a serious scholarly record. A structured king list with a theological apparatus attached, not folklore. What matters most for this video is the verdict the tradition reaches about what the Apkallu did. They are not punished. They are not bound. They are not hunted into darkness. Statues of the fish-cloaked Apkallu were buried beneath the foundations of Mesopotamian temples and palaces, set there deliberately as protective figures. Guardians embedded in the architecture of the cities they had helped create. Archaeologists excavating Assyrian palace foundations have recovered exactly this kind of buried figure, small bronze and clay Apkallu, placed at thresholds and corners, accompanied by inscribed instructions specifying where each one belonged and what it was meant to ward off. Ritual placement, not casual deposit. The Mesopotamian world looked at beings who crossed from the divine realm into human history and left behind the foundations of civilized life. And it did not see a crime. It saw a debt, and it repaid that debt with monuments. One piece of wider context is worth naming briefly, because it will matter again before this channel is finished with the subject. Mesopotamian cosmology places its gods inside something like a deliberative body, an assembly that decides matters affecting both heaven and earth. The Hebrew Bible preserves its own version of that idea. In Psalm 82, in 1 Kings 22, in Deuteronomy 32, a divine council, not a single throne. That comparison is a separate argument for a separate video. Hold only this: the Apkallu were not acting alone, and the world that sent them understood divine action as something closer to policy than to whim. A sage dispatched by Enki was, in that framework, an instrument of a decision the assembly had already reached, not a freelance act of divine generosity. The same logic recurs across the ancient Near East in different vocabularies, and recognizing it here will make the comparative argument easier to follow when this channel returns to it directly. One detail does not yet fit cleanly into this celebratory picture, and the tradition itself is the source of the friction. After the flood, the same flood that appears elsewhere in Mesopotamian literature as a near-total catastrophe, the record does not simply close the book on the Apkallu. It says they kept appearing, but changed. The nature of that change is not addressed anywhere in the texts describing the pre-flood sages. It surfaces later, attached to a different list of names. This chapter has built the foundation. That detail is for later. The Apkallu are the theological floor beneath Mesopotamian civilization. The reason, in that tradition's own account, that human beings have law, writing, kingship, and the capacity to build a city instead of merely surviving in one. But the communities that produced the Book of Enoch did not write in isolation from this material. They lived in or near Mesopotamia for generations, in periods of direct and sustained Babylonian influence. And when those communities came to write their own account of divine beings descending to teach humanity, they did not write about the Apkallu. They wrote about watchers. The difference between those two accounts is not regional flavor. It is a verdict. And the next chapter delivers it in full. The watchers of first Enoch descend, transfer knowledge, and stand connected to the flood. The same three elements that define the Apkallu tradition. By the end of this chapter, you will hold the Watcher account in enough detail to see the precise parallel and to recognize that the moral framing is not merely different, it is reversed. The account sits in 1st Enoch, chapters 6 through 10, 200 watchers, often associated with the Aramaic term Irin, watchers, who swear a collective oath on Mount Hermon to descend and take human wives. The tradition itself plays on the mountain's name, Hermon read against a Hebrew root, meaning curse or ban, so that the very location of the descent encodes, in the text's own wordplay, the verdict the tradition has already reached before the story even begins. They descend. They marry. The union produces the Nephilim, a hybrid offspring the text treats as monstrous from its first appearance. The text gives the oath itself weight as an act. Those who swear it are bound by a curse they impose on themselves, with Semyaza named first among equals, and the rest following in sequence, as if the order of the oath-taking were itself part of the record worth preserving. And the Watchers do not stop at marriage, they teach. This channel has already covered what they taught in detail in the Watchers' Forbidden Teachings episode. Azazel instructing humanity in metalworking, weapons, and the cosmetic arts. Gadriel delivering the specific instruments of death. Semyaza leading the collective oath that makes the entire descent possible. That content stands as established ground. What this chapter needs from it is narrower. The shape of the transfer, not its inventory. Divine beings cross a boundary. They teach humanity what humanity did not have. The teaching is named, sourced, and attributed to specific teachers. 1st Enoch 8:1 through 8:2 reads almost like a manifest, cataloging exactly which watcher taught exactly which forbidden art. The scholar John Collins, working specifically on Enochic literature within its Second Temple context, locates this material among communities for whom angelic and demonic mediation had become a primary way of explaining why the world had gone wrong despite the promises of the Torah. A literature responding to crisis, not idle speculation about angels for its own sake. The flood enters this account as a direct consequence, not a separate event. The Nephilim, in the text's own causal chain, fill the earth with violence. The earth itself cries out under the weight of what has been done to it, and the flood arrives as the response to that specific cry. There is no ambiguity in 1st Enoch about why the waters come. They come because of what the Watcher's transgression produced. The knowledge transfer and the flood are locked together as cause and consequence. Precisely the same structural position the Apkallu tradition assigns to its own flood, though with the moral sign reversed. And the verdict on the Watchers, when it arrives, is total. Azazel is bound and cast into the darkness of Dudael, a desert place named specifically for his confinement. The angel Raphael is dispatched by name to carry out the binding, a detail the text considers important enough to assign a named enforcer rather than leaving the punishment vague. Semyaza is bound beneath the hills, awaiting a judgment that has not yet come. Their offspring, the Nephilim, do not simply vanish from the narrative. Their fate becomes the origin of the demons the text says still roam the earth. restless because the bodies that housed them were destroyed in the flood, while the spirits within them were not. This is not a punishment that ends. It is a punishment still running. Set the two pictures beside each other without commentary, because the comparison does the work on its own. The Apkallu give law, and Mesopotamian tradition buries their statues in temple foundations as protective guardians. The Watchers give weapons, and the Enochic tradition buries Azazel in a desert named for his confinement. One act, divine beings crossing into human history, transferring what they know, produces a guardian in one tradition and a prisoner in the other. Descent, transfer, and the flood's place in the story all match between the two accounts. The verdict on the knowledge itself is the only variable that has changed, and it has changed completely. This parallel is precise enough that it raises an immediate and reasonable objection, and the next chapter does not skip past it. Two traditions, one shared pattern. Divine beings cross from the heavenly realm into human history, transfer what they know, and stand connected to a flood that arrives at the same point in both accounts. One produces civilization, the other produces corruption. One is honored with monuments, the other is bound in darkness. The parallel is specific enough that it raises a question more precise than most comparative mythology can support. But the obvious objection has to be addressed before that question can be answered honestly. Flood stories are common across the ancient Near East. Divine sage figures are a widespread archetype. Similarity on its own does not prove that one tradition borrowed from the other. That objection is legitimate. It is also, in this specific case, wrong. And the reason it is wrong is in the numbers. The parallel between the Apkallu and the Watchers is not merely structural. It is numerically and functionally specific in ways that generic flood mythology does not produce by accident. By the end of this chapter, you will hold the precise points of correspondence and understand why they indicate deliberate inversion rather than two cultures independently arriving at the same story. The scholarly caution deserves to be stated in full because it is a real position and not a straw man. Flood mythology is genuinely widespread across the ancient world. The Atrahasis epic, the flood tablet of Gilgamesh, the Genesis account of Noah, the Greek story of Deucalion, the Hindu account of Manu. Divine teachers and culture-bringing sages appear in some form across many unrelated traditions. The general instinct behind the caution that similar stories do not by themselves prove direct borrowing is sound reasoning, not naivety. Some scholars working specifically on this material remain unconvinced that the Watcher tradition depends directly on the Apkallu tradition, and argue instead that both draw independently on a shared ancient Near Eastern mythological reservoir, broad enough to produce structurally similar stories without any direct line of transmission between them. That is a serious position held by serious people, and it deserves to be named honestly before it is set aside. The Assyriologist Andrew George, whose work has done more than anyone else's to establish the textual history of the Gilgamesh flood tablet, has been similarly cautious about treating every flood and survivor story in the ancient Near East as evidence of direct dependence on a single source. Convergent invention, given how universally relevant catastrophic flooding was to civilizations built on river systems, remains a live possibility in the general case. 7 Apkallu before the flood. 200 watchers before the flood, named, numbered, ordered into ranks, divine beings descending from the heavenly realm. Divine beings descending from the heavenly realm. Knowledge of the arts of civilization, transferred to humanity. Knowledge transferred to humanity. The flood arriving as the boundary that ends the age of direct divine contact. A diminished divine being after the flood, named in the Mesopotamian record. This is not a shared reservoir. This is a conversation. One tradition is answering the other, and the direction of travel is not in question. The Enochic Watcher formulation postdates the Mesopotamian Apkallu tradition by centuries. The response runs one way. The specificity does not rest on matching head counts, and it should not be oversold as if it did. 7 Apkallu stand before the flood in the Mesopotamian record. 200 watchers, led by named chiefs of tens, stand before the flood in the Enochic record. The numbers are not the same, and forcing them into symmetry would overstate the case. What is shared is the function. Pre-flood divine beings, named and ordered rather than anonymous, who cross from the heavenly realm into human history and transmit knowledge humanity did not previously hold. A level of structural and functional detail that flood mythology in general does not produce on its own. The historical window for contact is not speculative. The communities that produced the Book of the Watchers. 1 Enoch, chapters 1 through 36, generally dated to the 3rd or 2nd century BC. Were writing in the aftermath of the Babylonian exile and within the Second Temple period, when Mesopotamian religious and intellectual material was not a distant curiosity, but an ambient cultural presence. These were not isolated communities, encountering Babylonian myth secondhand, centuries removed. These were communities for whom Babylonian tradition had been a lived political and cultural reality, generations deep. The archives that survive from exilic and post-exilic Jewish settlements in Babylonia, communities documented at sites such as Nippur, show Jewish families embedded in Babylonian administrative and scribal life, not sealed off from it, generation after generation. The vocabulary itself carries a fingerprint of contact. In Mesopotamian scholarly tradition, the Apkallu are sometimes designated by the term umanu, master craftsmen, wise men. And post-exilic Jewish tradition develops its own sage terminology along closely related conceptual lines. Lexical overlap of this kind does not occur between cultures with no contact. It occurs between cultures sharing scribal and scholarly institutions, even when those institutions are formally adversarial. The strongest single piece of evidence is not philological. It is argumentative. The scholar Amr Anis, in his study of the Apkallu and the fallen angels, makes the case directly. The Watcher tradition functions as a conscious polemical response to Apkallu mythology, not an independent parallel development. On Anis's reading, the authors of the Enochic material took the Mesopotamian framework whole. The descent, the 7 sages, the knowledge transfer. the flood, the post-flood diminishment, and reversed its moral verdict as a deliberate theological argument against Babylonian civilizational prestige. What Babylon celebrated as a divine gift, the Enochic tradition reframed as precisely what had gone wrong with Babylonian civilization. The argument was not produced by accident. It was constructed point by point against a specific target. One piece of the Apkallu record has not yet been folded into this argument. The diminishment the tradition says followed the flood, the detail this video named at the very beginning and has not yet explained. The next chapter reaches it. The parallel is deliberate, the inversion is intentional, and the direction of the argument is now strong enough that coincidence becomes the weaker explanation. The Enochic tradition took Babylon's own sacred origin story and declared that what Babylon called a gift, the Watcher's story calls a crime. But the single most theologically loaded detail in the entire Apkallu record has still not been addressed. After the flood, the tradition says, one of the beings who had taught humanity kept appearing, but he was no longer what he had been, Lu-Nanna, 2/3 Apkallu. And that diminishment, sitting quietly in the Mesopotamian record for thousands of years, encodes a theology of the boundary between divine and human that neither tradition has ever fully resolved. One post-flood figure in the Mesopotamian record, Lu-Nanna, is described as only 2/3 Apkallu. By the end of this chapter, you will understand exactly what that fraction means theologically, why it echoes directly in the description of Gilgamesh himself, and why both the Mesopotamian and the Enochic traditions encode the same unresolved question in their account of what happens to beings who cross the boundary between divine and human. This is the detail this video named in its opening seconds and has carried since. Lu-Nanna, 2/3 Apkallu. We are here. The textual source for the claim is the document scholars call the Uruk list of kings and sages, a cuneiform tablet compiled by Babylonian scribes as late as the Seleucid period, but preserving material understood to be far older, listing in sequence the names of the pre-flood Apkallu alongside the names of post-flood figures associated with specific historical kings. The pre-flood sages on this list are designated Apkallu of the god Ea, Ea being the Akkadian name for Enki. Fully divine teachers, sent directly from the god of wisdom. The post-flood figures on the same list carry a different designation. They are called Apkallu, who are human. The purely divine sage, sent whole from the Abzu, does not return after the waters recede. Something has changed in the category itself. One of these post-flood figures, named Lu-Nanna, is singled out in the record with a specific fraction attached to his identity. The detail this chapter turns to directly. The same Uruk list that records this shift also ties specific post-flood kings, Gilgamesh among them, to specific post-flood Umanu, preserving the same structured king-by-king transmission the pre-flood Apkallu received, even as the figures performing it are demoted from full divinity. The era epic, an Akkadian composition describing a period of divine-sanctioned catastrophe and its aftermath, preserves a related detail. In its account, an Apkallu figure is dispatched after the destruction to restore the cult statue and ritual order of a damaged temple. This is wisdom literature's way of saying that even after catastrophe, the function the Apkallu had always served, maintaining the link between divine order and human institutions, continued through whatever diminished agents remained available to perform it. The job survives the demotion of the beings doing it. The fraction attached to Lu-Nanna specifically, 2/3 Apkallu, is doing more theological work than a simple decline in status, and it does not stand alone in the tradition. The same fraction, inverted, describes Gilgamesh himself, the Uruk king list, and the Gilgamesh tradition both describe him as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, the most famous hybrid figure Mesopotamian literature produced. Read together, the two descriptions suggest a shared formula the tradition reaches for whenever it needs to measure exactly how much of the divine survives a crossing into human history. Lu-Nanna's fraction is not a universal description applied to every post-flood Apkallu. It is applied to him specifically, and its recurrence in Gilgamesh's own description is what gives it theological weight, rather than leaving it as an isolated curiosity. The Apkallu crossed from the divine realm into human history in order to give humanity what it did not have. The tradition's recurring use of this fraction suggests that the crossing itself left something behind in the beings who made it. That a species cannot have its knowledge transferred into it without the teacher giving away some part of what made the teacher what it was. The gift and the diminishment on this reading are not two separate events. They are the same event, described from two different angles. The Mesopotamian tradition does not treat this as a fall. The post-flood Apkallu remain honored figures, associated like their predecessors with wisdom and protection, still credited with maintaining what the earlier Apkallu had established. But the text is also not pretending nothing happened. Something has been shared that cannot be fully retrieved. A boundary that had been absolute, divine on one side and human on the other, with no traffic between them, is now porous in both directions. The tradition can be read as imagining that the Apkallu lost something of their original status in the act of transmission. Humanity, having received the me, holds something of the divine order it did not hold before. Neither side returns fully to where it started. The Enochic tradition encodes a structurally identical idea, though it reaches a very different verdict about it. The Watcher's union with human women produces the Nephilim, beings neither fully angelic nor fully human, a hybrid category created by exactly the kind of boundary crossing the Apkallu tradition describes. What survives the flood in the Enochic account is not the Nephilim themselves, but the spirits released when their bodies were destroyed. Disembodied beings who roam the earth afterward, belonging fully to neither realm, a population of in-between entities that persists into the post-flood world as the direct and lasting consequence of the original crossing. Structurally, this is the same phenomenon the Uruk list records for the post-flood Apkallu, a boundary violation that does not heal when the violating act ends, producing remainder beings who carry the mark of the crossing forward in time. The two traditions diverge entirely on what that remainder means. The Mesopotamian record treats the post-flood diminishment as a natural, even dignified consequence of having participated directly in human history. A cost, perhaps, but not a crime, and certainly not grounds for further punishment. The post-flood Apkallu are not hunted. The Enochic tradition treats its hybrid remainder as something closer to an infection. The disembodied Nephilim spirits become demons, the text's own word for disordered beings, whose continued existence is evidence of a transgression that should never have been allowed to occur. One tradition reads the leftover hybridity as a residue of contact. The other reads it as a wound that keeps producing harm. What both traditions agree on, underneath the disagreement about verdict, is something neither one states outright, but both encode in the same structural detail: that the crossing of the divine-human boundary changes both sides of it permanently, and that the change cannot be undone by the flood that follows it. Humanity is elevated in one reading, or corrupted in the other. But in neither tradition does humanity return to whatever it was before the Apkallu or the Watchers arrived. The divine beings are diminished in one reading and punished in the other. But in neither tradition do they return fully to what they were before they crossed. The boundary is not restored in either account. It is only ever managed, argued over, and assigned a verdict. And the fact that two traditions with opposite judgments about the knowledge transfer nonetheless converge on this same structural detail, a hybrid remainder persisting after the flood, is itself part of the evidence that one tradition is responding directly to the other rather than improvising independently. What the first 4 chapters have actually assembled is not a side-by-side survey of two ancient mythologies that happen to resemble each other. It is the evidence base for one specific claim: that the Book of Enoch inherited a Mesopotamian tradition it recognized, and deliberately reversed its moral framing as a theological statement about the nature of civilization, the origin of human corruption, and the proper boundary between the divine and the human. Up to this point, this video has been building that case. From here, the question changes. The second half asks what that reversal actually argues, what the Enochic tradition was arguing against, what it believed it was protecting by making the argument, and what was lost by both sides in the process of holding their opposed verdicts on the same original act. Both traditions record the same permanent consequence of the divine-human crossing: a boundary that does not close again once it has been opened. Beings on both sides who are no longer fully what they were. A world that carries the mark of the contact forward. What neither tradition asks directly, though the parallel forces the question into view, is whether the crossing itself was the transgression, or whether the transgression lived in the knowledge that crossed along with it. The answer each tradition gives to that question reveals what it actually believes humanity was before the Apkallu arrived, and what it believes humanity was always meant to become. The moral inversion between the Apkallu and the Watchers is not a difference in cultural taste. It is a theological argument. By the end of this chapter, you will understand exactly what the Enochic tradition claimed about civilization, knowledge, and the divine human boundary when it took Mesopotamia's knowledge giver, and turned him into a criminal. The Apkallu gave humanity writing, civilization, law. The Watchers gave humanity swords, sorcery, corruption. The Enochic tradition knew the Apkallu story. It looked at what Babylon called a gift, and it called it a crime. That is not a cultural misunderstanding. That is a verdict. Start with what the Mesopotamian tradition was actually celebrating. Babylonian civilization built its identity on precisely the achievements the Apkallu were credited with originating. Writing systems sophisticated enough to record law, astronomical observation precise enough to govern the calendar and the temple cult, legal codes detailed enough to administer cities of tens of thousands of people, architecture durable enough that some of it still stands. The Apkallu myth is, among other things, Babylon's account of its own sources of pride. The communities that produced the Enochic literature did not experience that civilization as a gift. They experienced it, for significant stretches of their history, as an occupying power. The Babylonian exile was not an abstraction to the authors of First Enoch. It was inherited memory, close enough to feel personal. When a tradition that has lived under a civilization's domination sits down to write its own account of where that civilization's knowledge came from, the result is unlikely to read as gratitude. The Enochic inversion takes the specific knowledge Babylon was proudest of and reassigns its source from a benevolent god of wisdom to a band of oath-bound rebels, and reassigns its consequence from civilizational flourishing to a flood, sent specifically to punish it. The targeting is not random. The forbidden teachings cataloged in 1 Enoch 8:1 through 8:2, astronomical knowledge, metalworking, the cosmetic arts, overlap substantially with the specific disciplines Babylonian civilization prized most highly. These are not generic sins selected for dramatic effect. They are Babylon's own prestige knowledge, named precisely and reassigned wholesale to the category of transgression that brought on a flood. The Enochic authors were not condemning vague wickedness. They were condemning a curriculum, and the curriculum they chose to condemn is recognizably Babylon's. Astronomical and astrological observation deserves particular attention here, because it was not peripheral to Babylonian civilization. It was central to it. Babylonian scholars tracked celestial omens for the royal court across centuries, building observational records precise enough that modern astronomers still use them to calibrate ancient eclipse data. Predicting the movements of the heavens was, in the Mesopotamian worldview, a direct extension of the same wisdom Enki had given the Apkallu to transmit. The capacity to read cosmic order and apply it to human affairs. The Enochic catalog of forbidden teachings does not overlook this. It singles out the reading of the stars and the casting of celestial omens as among the specific corruptions the Watchers introduced, taking Babylon's most prestigious science and filing it without ambiguity under sorcery. The instinct is not isolated to Enochic material. Hebrew prophetic literature elsewhere mocks Babylon's astrologers and monthly prognosticators directly, treating the same celestial expertise the Mesopotamian tradition prize as evidence of a civilization that had mistaken technical mastery for genuine wisdom. What the Enochic tradition was defending in making this argument was a specific account of what humanity's proper condition actually is. Not autonomous civilizational achievement, but covenant relationship with God, in which human flourishing depends on obedience to a relationship rather than on mastery of techniques. In that theology, the knowledge the Apkallu gave is precisely the knowledge that lets a society forget what it owes and to whom it owes it. Civilizational achievement and spiritual corruption collapse, in this reading, into descriptions of the same underlying process viewed from different angles. The Mesopotamian tradition was defending the opposite claim with equal seriousness: that humanity's proper condition is exactly the ordered, lawful, city-building life the me made possible, and that the knowledge enabling that life is not opposed to the divine order, but is the expression of it. Temples are not built in spite of the gods. They are built because the gods gave humanity the means to build them. These two positions cannot be reconciled into a single coherent theology. They disagree about what knowledge is, what civilization is for, and what the divine-human relationship is supposed to look like, not at the margins, but at the foundation. The tradition that eventually produced Western Christianity did not resolve this disagreement by choosing a side. It absorbed Enochic demonology. The fallen angels, the bound watchers, the inherited suspicion of forbidden knowledge. While simultaneously retaining a broadly positive theology of human cultural achievement inherited from other strands of its own tradition. The result is a synthesis that holds two incompatible verdicts on the same underlying question without ever fully reconciling them, arrived at not through deliberate decision, but through centuries of accumulation. Somewhere in that accumulation, the Apkallu, the original holder of the position, the synthesis, half absorbed and half rejected, simply dropped out of memory. Not refuted, not debated, just no longer part of the conversation anyone remembered having. The Enochic inversion is a deliberate theological argument against Babylonian civilizational theology, and that argument was encoded permanently into the figures who became, through everything built on top of them since, the fallen angels of the Western religious imagination. Which means that every later tradition built on the Watcher mythology, the developed demonology, the fallen angel framework, the cosmic war between light and darkness running through centuries of subsequent theology, was built on a foundation that was itself an argument against something specific, against a tradition that read the divine human crossing as gift rather than transgression. And that tradition has been almost entirely invisible to everyone who has built on top of the argument against it ever since. The Western tradition built a major strand of its demonology on the Watcher mythology without knowing it was building on a polemical response to an earlier tradition it had already stopped remembering. By the end of this chapter, you will understand what that forgetting cost, what the Apkallu preserved that the Watcher tradition argued against, and what changes if that earlier position is recovered. The Mesopotamian textual tradition did not survive the fall of Babylon intact. Cuneiform literacy declined and eventually disappeared, and with it went direct access to the Apkallu as a named, detailed tradition, preserved only in fragments, in king lists, in the second-hand Greek transmission of writers like Berossus. By the time the New Testament communities were writing, the Apkallu were not a living theological reference point for anyone. The Watchers survived. The tradition the Watchers had been built to answer did not. What disappeared with the Apkallu was a coherent alternative theology, one in which human cultural achievement is a legitimate divine gift rather than a symptom of corruption, in which crossing the boundary between divine and human is participation in an ongoing act of creation rather than a violation of an order that should have stayed fixed, and in which the knowledge that built cities and codified law is sacred precisely because it descended from a God of wisdom rather than from a band of oath-bound rebels. The fallen angel tradition that runs from the Watchers through later Jewish, Christian, and Islamic angelology carries the argument against the Apkallu forward without any memory of who it was originally arguing against. A major strand of the fallen angel tradition is, on this reading, built from inverted benefactor figures, drawn from a civilization that the tradition demonizing them had been responding to directly. And the response succeeded completely enough that the original terms of the debate were simply lost. The historian of religion, Annette Yoshiko Reed, has traced this transmission in detail, how the fallen angel framework migrated from Enochic Judaism into early Christian demonology, and from there into Islamic angelology, accumulating elaboration at each stage while shedding almost completely any awareness of the Mesopotamian material the framework had originally been built to answer. By the time later, tradition was debating the nature, numbers, and hierarchy of fallen angels. The question of what those angels had originally been invented to argue against was no longer being asked by anyone, because no one writing those later debates had any reason to suspect there had been an argument in the first place. None of this requires abandoning the Watcher tradition or treating it as somehow less real or less theologically serious than it has always been taken to be. Recovering the Apkallu does not refute the Watchers. It contextualizes them, turning what looked like a freestanding cosmic transgression into what it actually was. One specific, datable side of an argument that had another side, now visible again. Reading the Watchers alongside the Apkallu does not soften the Enochic verdict or explain it away. It simply restores the conversation the verdict was always part of, so that a tradition which has been read for 2,000 years as a self-contained account of cosmic rebellion can also be read accurately as one half of an argument with a named opponent. The archetype underneath both sides has appeared under other names too. Enki as the benevolent donor in Mesopotamia, Prometheus as the heroic transgressor in Greek tradition, Azazel as the condemned criminal in the Enochic account. Same pattern. 3 traditions. 3 completely different verdicts on what it meant. A thread this channel will follow on its own terms, in full, in a future episode. Here is what this episode has built. The Apkallu, 7 divine sages, sent by Enki before the flood, appearing as winged men or as sages cloaked in the bodies of fish, who gave humanity writing, law, architecture, and the arts of civilized life, and whom Mesopotamian tradition honored as the greatest benefactors humanity ever received. The Watchers, 200 divine beings who descended on Mount Hermon, who taught humanity weapons, sorcery, and the forbidden arts, and whom the Enochic tradition condemned as the origin of all sin, bound in darkness until a judgment still to come. The parallel: pre-flood divine sages and pre-flood watchers alike, descent from the divine realm, the transfer of knowledge to humanity. The flood as the boundary that ends it, and diminished or punished beings appearing on the far side of that boundary. A correspondence precise enough in structure and function that coincidence becomes the weaker explanation. The inversion, the same pattern, the same kind of figures, the same flood, the same structural consequences. One tradition's benefactor is the other tradition's criminal, with nothing separating the two verdicts except what each tradition believed the knowledge itself was for. The post-flood Apkallu, Lu-Nanna, recorded as 2/3 Apkallu. The same fraction later attached to Gilgamesh. The boundary blurred permanently by the act of transfer itself, a theology in which elevation and corruption were never fully separable to begin with. And the question neither tradition resolves: whether the knowledge that makes civilization possible is a gift that elevated a limited creature, or a corruption that damaged a creature that had been something else before the gift arrived. The Mesopotamian answer to where civilization came from is that it was given by beings who crossed the boundary between the divine and the human, who lived among humanity long enough to hand over what they knew, and who made human beings what they have been ever since. The flood came. The Apkallu withdrew, diminished by the very act of having taught. What they left behind is everything later ages would call culture. And the verdict Mesopotamian tradition reached on that gift, recorded for thousands of years in buried statues and king lists, is gratitude. The Enochic answer is that the same crossing, the same archetypal role, reframed under a different name, was a transgression rather than a gift. What was handed over was not elevation. It was corruption. The weapons, the vanity of adornment, the sorcery. The flood in this account was not an ending. It was a punishment that did not fully take. Azazel still bound, Semyaza still beneath the hills, the demons of the Nephilim still loose in the world, waiting for a fire that has not yet arrived. The unsettling part is not that civilization, on the Enochic reading, turns out to be evil. It is narrower and harder to dismiss than that. It is that the capacity to build, to write, to govern, to construct cities and codify law, and the capacity to destroy, to forge weapons, to corrupt, to bring on a flood, arrived in the same transfer, from the same source, carried by figures occupying the same archetypal role. The Apkallu gave humanity writing and law. The Watchers gave humanity swords and sorcery. If the parallel holds as precisely as the evidence suggests it does, if these are structurally the same archetype read through two opposed theological lenses, then the gift and the corruption were never two separate deliveries. They came as one. Two traditions, separated by 1,000 years, and an inverted verdict, agree on more than either one would likely admit. that whatever crossed the boundary between the divine and the human did not arrive in pieces that could later be sorted into the part worth keeping and the part worth condemning. It arrived whole. The civilization and the danger came bound together, in the hands of the same beings, on the same night. Whichever verdict feels more honest to you. Gratitude or warning. Notice what it requires you to believe about the knowledge you yourself rely on every day. The writing, the law, the architecture, the inherited accumulation of a civilization. Neither the Apkallu nor the Watchers have anything left to say about directly. The traditions disagree about where it came from. Neither one offers a way to have the civilization without whatever traveled alongside it. That is the inheritance, however it arrived, and it is the only one on offer.